John chapter 19, Jesus delivered to be crucified. Here we go. Then Pilate took Jesus and he flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. And they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and he said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Pilate was basically desperate to prove that Jesus was innocent, and yet the people demanded it. They demanded it. All right, there's a lot of symbolism in that, but let's keep on going. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Think about that. Jesus Christ, man, God becomes man, and he represents all of mankind. He is your perfect image. Black Bear, thank you very much, brother. He represents all of mankind as an individual man. God and man united together in Jesus. And Pilate says, "Behold the man," right? He's not just an example for us, he's an example of us. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." And the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again, and he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified. You see, guys, Pilate did all he could to stop what was happening, but the people demanded the crucifixion of God in the flesh. Behold the man, in whom Pilate found no guilt. The crucifixion. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha, or Golgotha. And there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Many people think this could have been Barabbas, but remember, they released him and put Jesus in his place. So they released the robber, the man who caused a stir, and they put Jesus right in the middle. Pilate also wrote an inscription, and he put it on the cross, and it read, quote, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," end quote. And many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather," this man said, "I am the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Quick little story, guys. Golgotha, the place of the skull, there is a belief that this is where the first man was buried. I was there in Golgotha. I was over there. And right below the crucifixion spot, there's a little place that's called the tomb of Adam, so to speak. This is where they believe the first man, Adam, was buried, right? And here we have the second man, Adam, being crucified. And there's a lot here to believe about this. And, you know, God can orchestrate the most incredible connections that we only come to realize well after the fact. But this is what many believe. Golgotha, the place of the skull of the first man, Adam. They believe this is where he died, where his body was buried, where his skull was in the ground, so to speak. Okay, that's where that gets that name. If you've never heard that before, so quite the connection. The first man, Adam, and the last Adam crucified in the same spot. So here we go. Pilate says, "What I have written, I have written." Now, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and they divided them into 4 parts, one part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. And so they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." Is it ringing a bell to anybody? This was to fulfill the scripture which says, quote, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Can you imagine? We'll take John's perspective here. He's writing everything down. He's detailing what it was. And he notices at the time they're tearing up the garments. They're doing certain things, casting lots. And then he's going, oh my goodness, the light bulbs are going off. It's happening. This is the Son of God. This is God in the flesh, the Word become flesh. He's fulfilling the prophecy that was spoken about years before. So the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, John, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. All right, give me 1 second here. I'm going to jump over to the Mirror version. It says this: standing by the cross were the 3 Marys, the mother of Jesus, his Aunt Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the beloved disciple standing nearby, he said to her, "Ma'am, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that moment, the disciple adopted her as his own mother. Westcott remarks upon the 4 exclamations in this chapter. Remember, behold the man, behold your king, behold your son, and behold your mother. This gives us a remarkable picture of what Christ is and what he reveals people to be. With this, Jesus, realizing that now all things are fully accomplished and that what was written was to be fulfilled, said, "I thirst." Everything is now done. Jesus studied the scripture with a different intent. He knew that he was reflected there. Familiar with the text, he brought context. Hebrews 10:7, quote, "Then I said, I read in your book what you wrote about me. So here I am. I have come to fulfill my destiny." This is referenced in Psalm 47, Luke 4:17, Luke 24:27, and 44. Here we go. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scriptures, quote, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine stood there. And so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. Some say vinegar. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, quote, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. When Jesus had taken the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." He then bowed his head and handed over the spirit. See Psalm 31:5, quote, "Into your hand I commit my spirit." The word tetelestai communicates the final consummation of all things. Everything is now concluded. John again, just as in verse 28, records this powerful word in the perfect passive tense, which denotes an action which is completed in the past, but the effects of which are regarded as continuing into the present without end. Nothing that happens in time could possibly intercept this act of God's redemptive genius. The only possible way we can delay the glory that follows the cross is by underestimating what happened there when Jesus died and when Jesus cried, "It is finished." There is no eschatology of anyone's guess or definition that carries more weight than God's eschatos, his final word that he spoke to us in sonship. In the one who bears the very stamp, the character of his nature, and radiates the Father's perfect being, the one seated upon the throne of mankind's redeemed innocence. Hebrews 1:1-3 says, we can afford to make Jesus' words on the cross, quote, "It is finished," our final complete and our final focus. Charles Spurgeon said, in the word tetelestai, we have an ocean of meaning in a drop of language. Jesus' side is pierced. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken so that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Quote, not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says, quote, they will look on him who they have pierced. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, remember him? Remember Nicodemus asking to be born again? How does this happen? Do I go back in my mother's womb? Remember Nicodemus? Here he is. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and they bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Here's what it says in the Mirror version. Then Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate permission to remove the body of Jesus, which Pilate was pleased to do. Joseph was a prominent leader and a secret follower of Jesus. But here, while most of his close friends and followers forsook him, Joseph fearlessly offers to bury Jesus in his own rock-hewn tomb. See Matthew 27:60. Joseph was a rich man and a counselor of the great Sanhedrin. Luke 23:50, Mark emphasizes the boldness of this act. Mark 15:43. Also, Nicodemus, who was the one who approached Jesus in the shelter of the night in order to not be publicly associated with him, made a very bold announcement of his love for Jesus and brought expensive, sweet-smelling spices, a mixture of myrrh and aloes, which weighed nearly 100 pounds. And then Joseph and Nicodemus took Jesus' body and prepared it for burial. And according to Jewish custom, they wrapped the body in linen cloth together with the spices. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. That wraps John chapter 19.